Hello and welcome to Migration Matters Festival. It's really lovely to have each and every one of you join us tonight. Whatever platform, whatever country you're in, give us a shout in all the comments wherever you are. My name is Chiwe Chihana and I'll be hosting this amazing poet. Her name is Suhaiymah Manzoor Khan. She's a writer, poet, speaker, and educator who has written for Guardian Independent, Al Jazeera, and it's just an inspiration. So I'll be taking you on a journey with her through her debut poetry collection, which is called Post-Colonial Banter. Suhaiymah, welcome to Migration Matters Festival.
Thank you so much for having me, and hi to everybody who's excited to be here. And I'm really, it's such a fantastic festival. All the events look amazing, and I'm just excited for this conversation we're going to have.
So lovely to have you. Could you just tell us a little bit about yourself before we actually get into it?
For sure. So I think it's always a bit weird trying to introduce yourself. But I think it's an interesting question as well, because I think sometimes some people find it easier to grasp certain titles than other people do. And so it's only recently that I've sort of decided I am a poet. That is something that I feel like I can say. But I definitely feel like being an educator and a poet are very connected for me. They're not separate things. I think education is through the poetry, and I think education itself can be quite poetic. And I think for me, the different types of writing that I do, like you mentioned some of the journalism type of writing, but also whether it's an essay for an anthology or playwriting, I think for me all of those forms of writing are just means for both teaching and learning. And I think it's always that process that's ongoing for me that is exciting. And I think part of how we change the world is just as we do it. For me, that's very much at the center of things. More usefully, maybe, I was born in Bradford. I grew up in Leeds. I went to a pretty normal state school, and then I later went to Cambridge University to study history, which I only mentioned to say that is where I was sort of, I would say, radicalized, in the sense that I recognized the violence and the depth of structural racism in British society and in British institutions, which then kind of fed into most of the work that I do. So most of the work I do is around kind of exposing and questioning narratives to do with race, racism, Islamophobia, migrants, like all the sorts of things that I'm sure we'll get into today. And I guess maybe the last thing to add is just that for me, everything that I do and my politics are rooted in Islam and in a radical sense of hope, I think, that does come from faith and is a testament to faith, where I do believe the world can be changed and that we have to be invested in changing it. That's probably maybe a few random and maybe hopefully useful facts about me.
No, absolutely. I'm really fascinated. Of course, I'm excited because I've had a bit of a glimpse into your work, but I'm more interested in hearing you read your poetry out for us. Before we get into it, what was the inspiration behind Post-Colonial Banter, the title itself, and then the work, the body?
That's a good question. I'm just going to hold it up since I don't know how many chances I'll have to do that.
Yeah, I'll look at
so
that.
Post-Colonial Banter, it's a good question. The title for me, I think it sums up this kind of contradiction in which I think many other people in Britain live in, which is where I feel often torn between sort of disbelief and shock, and like there's a sense of sometimes that things are so awful that you can only laugh about them. And I have a friend with whom we just sort of share we'll share like articles and stuff about the terrible things, terrible news, and then we'll just sort of be like, sometimes things are so mammoth that if you actually were to process them, I think the trauma would be so harsh that I know for a lot of us, it's those moments of sort of laughter that also exist in that grief. And I think for me, Post-Colonial Banter was trying to sum up almost in an ironic way that that and also trying to sum up, I think, the way that things like post-colonialism are seen as sort of only for academics and like sort of, intellectual public speakers or whatever to talk about. But then having banter in that title as well for me that's something else I'm invested in, is about kind of saying that the knowledge of people who experience things in the world is a valid form of knowledge, and you don't need to be a doctoral candidate to
No.
know what your experience is and what racism is in the world, which is, I guess, at the core of a lot of. So yeah, maybe that's a bit of a.
That's a good, no, that's amazing. That's really beautiful. I mean, only you and your lived experience would understand what that looks like. Um, so for all the audiences, anybody watching us right now, don't forget to drop us some questions in the comment section or in the Q&A. Now that you've heard a bit about Suhaiymah. Suhaiymah, you're reading us the first poem. I think this is called "This Is Not a Humanizing Poem."
Thank you. Just want to preface this by saying performing through digital media where you can't see anybody in the audience has been a very strange experience. So please bear with me. All right, this is not a humanizing poem. Some poems force you to write them. The way sirens force their way through window panes in the night, and you can't shut out the news even when you try. Write a humanizing poem, my pen and paper go to. Show them how wrong their preconceptions are. Be relatable. Write something upbeat for a change. Crack a smile. Tell them how you also cry at the end of Toy Story 3, and you're just as capable of bantering about the weather in the post office queue. Like everyone, you have no idea how to cook the perfect amount of pasta. Still, feed them stories of stoic humor. Make a reference to childhood. Tell an anecdote about being frugal. Mention the X Factor. Be domestic, successful, add layers. Tell them you know brown boys who cry. About the sides of Assads, Amirs, and Hassans they don't know. The complex inner worlds of Sumayyas and Aishas. Tell them comedies as well as tragedies. How full of life we are. How full of love. But no, I put my pen down. I will not let that poem force me to write it because it is not the poem I want to write. It is the poem I have been reduced to proving my life is human because it is relatable, valuable because it is recognizable. But good GCSEs, family, and childhood memories are not the only things that count as a life. Living is. So this will not be a Muslims are like us poem. I refuse to be respectable. Instead, love us when we're lazy, love us when we're poor, love us in our back-to-backs, council estates, depressed, unwashed, and weeping, love us high as kites, unemployed, joyriding, time-wasting, failing at school, love us filthy, without the right colour passports, without the right sounding English, love us silent, unapologising, shopping in Poundland, skiving off school, homeless, unsure, sometimes violent, love us when we aren't athletes, when we don't bake cakes, when we don't offer our homes or free taxi rides after the event, when we're wretched, suicidal, naked, and contributing nothing. Love us then. Because if you need me to prove my humanity, I'm not the one that's not human. My mother texts me too after BBC News alerts. Are you safe? Let me know you're home okay. And she means safe from the incident, yes, but also from the after effects. So sometimes I wonder, which days of the week might I count as liberal, and which moments of forehead to the ground do I count as conservative? I wonder, when you buy bombs, is there a clear difference between the deadly ones that kill and the heroic ones which scatter democracy? Isn't it really guilty until proven innocent? How can we kill in the name of saving lives? How can we illegally detain in the name of maintaining the law? I can't write it. I put my pen away. I won't write it. Is this radical? Am I radical? Because there is nowhere else left to exist now.
Oh, child. That's powerful. Goodness.
Thank you.
That's just brilliant, Suhaiymah. So tell me about that one.
Sure. I mean, the context of it, I think it kind of helps to situate it a bit.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote that poem after the London Bridge attack in 2017. It was in June, it was in Ramadan, I'm sure everyone remembers. And the context for me was just that I had been fasting. It was a day of Ramadan, and I'd cycled to the mosque that evening, and I'd prayed in congregation. And then as I'd left the mosque, I'd got a text from my mum that said, be careful on your way home. I don't know if you've seen the news. And I just remember thinking, I had this sinking feeling. I knew something bad had happened, for it to be on the news. But somehow that was also, my mum was then connecting that to my safety on my way home, right? And I think there was something in that connection which I couldn't articulate in that moment, and which I think only through trying to write this poem, which, the truth of the poem is what I tell you, that I was trying to write a poem where for so many drafts and versions of it, I realized all I was doing was trying to prove to people, I'm not one of those. I'm a good one. Please, like, don't lump me in there. Please don't attack me on the basis of that. But then what I realized was that to do that would be kind of to actually kind of acknowledge that my humanity is conditional in the first place, that I have to prove something in order to be deemed human, valuable, somebody who, is not deemed a suspect or threat. And I think the situation for, all Muslims and so many migrants and so many people of color in this country is that our humanity isn't conditional. And actually you are asked to prove all these things, jump through all these hoops in order to simply be seen as, good. And I think actually writing that poem made me adopt a new sort of politics, I think, and a new attitude towards that whole thing, which is to never actually try to prove my goodness or my, palatability. Because I think in doing that, when we do actually try and prove that we are good, we are, worthy or valuable, we contribute to society, we're productive, I think what happens is we actually accidentally assert that there are a class of migrants or Muslims or refugees or whoever that don't deserve humanity. And we actually reinforce that. So, I mean, a recent example would just be this idea that, Black and ethnic minority workers in the NHS, they're amazing, the key workers, they're fantastic. And yet, in doing that, it hasn't changed our material outcomes. We still know that Black and brown people are disproportionately dying in this pandemic, disproportionately living in poverty in this country. And so it hasn't actually, that kind of idea of celebrating the good ones doesn't do anything to change our material conditions. And on the other hand, what it does do is it says, if you're not a good one, do you even deserve change conditions? Do you know what I mean? So actually, maybe 15% of Muslims should be in prison in the UK. Do you know what? Maybe 50% of young people in custody should be ethnic minority. And I think that whole logic is so violent on a set of many, many different scales.
Absolutely. And it just reminds me of something you had actually said. It's something about imposing conditions on your ability to be recognized as human. Very powerful. Thank you for that. Can we go into your next poem, please?
Yeah, for sure.
Which is Where Is My History?
For sure. Actually, can I just add one point before I do that as well?
Absolutely,
is that I think just jumping off what you said then as well, I think that, this good immigrant, bad immigrant kind of binary also is weaponized against us as a society. So I was just thinking today, I'm sure a lot of people have seen today and yesterday, the news that the woman who's been put in in charge of organizing the Race Inequality Commission is a woman called Munira Mirza, and she, she's a brown woman. I think she's Pakistani. She's from Manchester, and yet her rhetoric is extremely racist. She denies institutional racism exists. She says, all these sort of really harmful things. She's been saying them for the last 2 decades. But what's interesting is that she's seen by the state and by the government, this is a good one. This is an example of what a good person of color should be. They shouldn't be talking about race. They shouldn't be talking about oppression.
Toe the line. Yeah.
And so her obedience then to that status quo harms all of us who will, buy this report. It will be shown, God only knows what will be shown. But yeah, I just think it's important as well to think about the ways in which that's used against us.
Absolutely. No, definitely. That's true. Yeah. Please go ahead into your next poem.
I'm going to read this.
There are lots of questions starting to come up in comments, so that's really nice. Yeah.
Awesome. So yeah, this poem is called wrong one. Where is my history?
Where is my history?
Yeah. I won't explain it. So. My history is imprinted in the spaces between the ink printed on pressed pages. My history is the screams shouting out through the silent slots in syllabi. It is caged in glass cases, said to be for its own safety by institutions which narrate it as their own. Because my history lies in the choices not recorded, about which stories should be hoarded and called archives. And my archives are the chicken shops, the taxi stops, the backseats of rentals, the inside hems of headscarves, women's conversations, women's congregations, women's contemplations, which you will not find in your local heritage site. No. Because my history is the shame of your history, the body buried in the back garden with no gravestone, but in fact not so shameful, no, for it is also adorning your proudest buildings, the ones I'm searched before entering, as if my bringing something in would be disturbing, as if my things weren't already coveted and stolen, sorry, read salvaged and reallocated, to make up these museums in the first place. It's almost as if history is less about what happened than maintaining ideology. Because when you investigate a story with half the participants absent, and don't worry about the translation, want only to fit the narrative to the nation, then is it surprising that what's surmised is that my history is not, that my past is culture and ancient kingdoms, never politics or philosophy. My ideas are religion and oriental, tribes, norms, and alternative remedies, whilst yours are universal teleologies and superior methodologies. No, it's no surprise my past is passed over and pushed into the peripheries despite being palpable in every premise of what gives Britain history. Because to find it would be to remember that if Britain is Tudors and Victorians, it is also slavers and plantations, the colonies and the colonized. To find my past would be to remember that every object in the museum that is said to be objectively seen was plundered and stripped of value for the perusal of researchers and big purses to spectate and win awards. Whilst those of us who are still seen as backwards, who don't get the time or space to explore artifacts, are in fact the outcome of their unnarrated relations to colonial plunder and false salvation. So when you ask where my past is, ask instead what yours is without mine. Thank you.
I'm just going to clap. I'm sure people are clapping out there. That's the thing with these platforms. Absolutely. That's amazing. But can you believe just how timely that is? Because that's literally a letter to present day. So, I mean, just yesterday, our Prime Minister was talking about editing of history because people are challenging the statues that bear colonial history. But obviously, we've been living in a society where our history has been edited, our British history, colonialism that you've just tackled in that one. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I completely agree with you. I think I just reading it then as well, I was thinking, gosh, it is completely timely. I think it's interesting to see the way this debate, if we want to call it that, is taking place in the public sphere, because what I think people don't understand is that history, and I say this as somebody who studied history in what's supposedly, the world's best history department, Cambridge University, right?
Yeah.
History is never about the past. It is always about the present. So what I mean by that is that you decide is worth studying is shaped entirely by your present occupations. Who you decide is worth commemorating is shaped entirely by your present preoccupations. And so really I think the only comment that needs to be said about the whole statues debate is who we're commemorating today tells us what past we are invested in. So whilst we're still invested in a slave holding, slave trading past, then that tells us everything we need to know about this country. On the other hand, if we could see different statues, if we could see different stories, that would tell us that this country is willing to have a more complex narration of itself. And for me, the statues thing, this whole thing about, what we count as even a historical source, we don't count oral history. My final project during university was using oral history project, speaking to immigrant women. And I had to work so hard just to prove that their experiences were as valid as a source that was found in the archive, because both are just a perception of somebody's idea of what was going on in that moment. Just as if you were to build, in the future, if you were to build narrative of this moment, this coronavirus crisis, based on my journal entries only or my recordings only, how could you call that a full record? You couldn't. No. So, yeah, I think I always like to kind of challenge people to think about the ways that they think history is about, that history is fact.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I found myself that in my writing, actually, I've been compelled to sort of use my poetry as a way of documenting my version of my history, what my grandparents taught me, what my parents taught me, what I know about my lived experience, and the history that I know that I didn't pick up in school, but definitely exists. And so my writing, I think, in very similar ways to what you're doing, is documenting what's been passed on to me, but also using the same weapon that's been used against us as migrant communities, and documenting it, really. So
that's so cool. I love that. And I think, I know I do, because I think there's something so disruptive about that as well. Like we're told that you know, on the one hand, when you're in school, you're told that poetry is this really elite form of kind of speaking and prose that it's kind of like doesn't make sense when you're studying it. But on the other hand, poetry has always belonged to oral cultures, which like so much of the countries that many migrants in this country come from have. But also for me, I think as well, there's the additional thing that, you know, poetry is always, it's always been the language of prisoners, of protesters, of revolutionaries, of you know, Black feminists, and also from an Islamic standpoint, poetry is like such a rich tradition, and the Quran, you know, part of the reason that it's so compelling to the society it arrives to is that they are a society that love poetry, and they're like, this book is so, you know, poetic in a way that we couldn't even capture in our own speech. So I think, I completely agree with you. I think if we, you know, if we were to remove poetry as a source, if we weren't to treat it as a valid source of knowledge, then we would lose so much in the history of the world, because so much of our histories are in poetry. So I think it's really cool, as you're saying, to us, for us to think also about how we're using our poetry to archive this present moment.
Yeah, and to use the same weapon that's been used against us and just weaponize it in our own way, with our own facts as well. Now, you just touched on a little bit about being a Muslim and how the texts are poetic in nature. Read us your next poem. What does it mean to be a Muslim woman?
Yeah, so I'll just say a bit of context about this one. Early, maybe 2 years ago, I got an email one day that was from a Radio 4 producer who was making a documentary, and the documentary was going to be called, and I think it is called, it's basically something about like how to be a Muslim woman. That's it, how to be a Muslim woman. And I'm very skeptical about anyone who's trying to kind of, it seems like they're trying to essentialize or kind of homogenize what Muslim women are, who Muslim women are. I'm very cautious. Anyway, in the end, you know, I was open to the conversation, and the podcast does exist, and it's quite funny to listen to because I'm really hostile throughout the whole thing. But anyway, the question
I don't think so.
I was sent some questions in advance, and one of the questions that I was sent was, what does it mean to be a Muslim woman?
Right.
And I just thought that was such a wild question. So this was my sort of poetic response. What does it mean to be a Muslim woman? To be a Muslim woman is to never speak for oneself, to never exist for oneself, but for everyone else. To know that even when you speak, you are not heard unless it fits the narrative. To exist only to justify your existence. To be a Muslim woman is to be asked, but already decided. A political pawn, a justification for invasion, a weapon to strike against Islam. It is to be always an object of fascination, veiled body, object of desire, mystery body, object of ridicule, letterbox body, always an object. To be a Muslim woman is to be represented or representative, but never real. Even to correct misrepresentation, you are reduced to other representations. To be a Muslim woman is to be picture, but never painter. To be surreal, uncanny, not quite. To be an outsider to yourself, a conversation, a joke, a jibe. It is to be always already framed. To be made excruciatingly small and impossibly big at once. To be swallowed and vomited out at the same time. To be a Muslim woman is to be always fought over, but never fought for.
Whoa. You are visibly Muslim. I'm sure you're drawing a lot of what you've written from that. Humanize it for me in your humane way, in your human way, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that last line, I think particularly, it does encapsulate so much of how it feels, I think, to be a not only visibly Muslim woman in this society, but it's a question I often think about because I am performing as well, right? I'm performing my poems, I'm a spoken word poet, I'm kind of in the public eye in a specific way as well. And I think you end up asking yourself so many questions in that position because it often feels like there are all these, sometimes how I imagine it is when I stand up on a stage, all these comic bubbles pop up in people's heads around my head. And, you know, they range from, why does she really wear it? Is she really oppressed? And all these questions that, you know, people have have internalized from the media and political culture of this country and Europe in general. And I think having all that there, it just feels like when you speak, you're so rarely heard because people are just listening out for the answers to those questions, and they will extract. And when I say they, I'm really just talking about this broader culture. There's a real, it is that lens that is upon you, this gaze. That's how I call it. I did this performance last year and I called it, whose eyes are these anyway? And what I was really trying to get at is, how do you look at yourself in a world that has told you who you are, what you are? You're oppressed, you're submissive, you're backwards, you're inferior, you're all these things. And also, where is the space to actually to speak on your own terms? And I think it's something that we see particularly. I mean, I think there's something specific to being a Muslim woman in the sense that fine line, always being fought over but never being fought for, because I think so often the kind of conversations about Muslim women are presented as if they care about Muslim women, as if it's about our well-being or our safety, and like, oh, we need to protect them from misogyny, or we need to protect them from a couple of years ago there was this whole Ofsted debate where it was like Ofsted said they're gonna start asking primary school girls, why they're wearing headscarves if they were, to find out whether they're being sexualized, right? And so my whole question with that was, if your real concern was, how and why are girls being sexualized, and if they are, why then would you pinpoint one specific ethnic, cultural, religious group of people? You wouldn't. And I think there's a real disingenuity that comes to when we talk about Muslim women. And for me, the way I felt that the most painfully is, as I was sort of becoming politicized, when I was younger, I definitely came through the lens of, I'm a woman, society's not fair, men are all in positions of power. But when I realized that feminism itself actually also reduced me so often to being just this person with no agency, somebody who needed to be saved from herself and from her own religion and from her scarf and from all these things, I had to really then question, what role have conversations about me as a Muslim woman had in people justifying oppressing me? And I always love to point out that the links are very clear to colonialism, and we can compare, how Lord Cromer is a really good example, right? So Lord Cromer was somebody who, in the 1800s, the late 1800s, he was in charge of Egypt when Britain was under British occupation. And his big narrative was that, we're here to save these people, they're backwards, they're derb. And one of the reasons they're backwards is that, look at Muslim women, they cover themselves, all of this stuff. At the same time, he was the head of the anti-women's suffrage league in the UK. So he didn't care about it. Again, it's this thing, he actively didn't want women to vote. He didn't want women to have rights in society. He didn't want them to have, kind of political agency. But this idea of this narrative, and I think you see that today so often in kind of mainstream feminism in a different guise, so whether it's like, oh, we really need to go save these women in Afghanistan by bombing them and destroying their society and their homes and their civic infrastructure. And I think an image that always represents that to me is in 2001, I think it's 2001, or I think it's just before the invasion of Iraq. Invasion of Afghanistan. Yeah, before the invasion of Afghanistan, there's this image, you can Google it, and it's Oprah Winfrey, weirdly, sort of actually unveiling this Afghan woman, so supposedly, and so it's like this image of this burqa being lifted off this woman, and the invasion of Afghanistan is called Operation Liberation, I think, Operation Freedom, something like that, something like really dodgy, right? Now, in the 1950s and 60s, during the Algerian War of Independence against the French, who occupied Algeria, they would also have these unveiling ceremonies where they would get Muslim women and they would say, look, we're freeing you, we're ridding you of your oppressive culture. And so I think it's really important for, so with all that history and all those narratives, how then, as a Muslim woman who covers my head, do I even begin to try to speak when people have all these different ideas and narratives about who I am, what I am, why I'm doing things? And so I think for me, that poem is really speaking to the fact that I don't know what to tell you what it means to be a Muslim woman, because so often what it means is just to never have the space to speak for yourself and to always just be having to defend yourself.
And it's almost always what you want to hear about me as a Muslim woman. You're not ready to hear my narrative around this. And I agree with you on mainstream feminism. So I self-identified as feminist for a very long time until I stumbled upon what a womanist is. and I felt like I was taking back the power and controlling the narrative of how my understanding of what a woman is to be Black and to be of African heritage. And so this is exactly what you're doing. I take it that's you again controlling the narrative through your work.
Yeah, I think so. I think partly as well, what sometimes you'll notice in my poetry, I actually just refuse to answer the question in the end, because it's like I would rather shine the light on the questioner, you know. And I think that's something so powerful in general when people are asked to defend their humanity, or, you know, I think for Muslims it often comes in the shape of, you know, do you condemn what happened in XYZ terrorist attack? And I think what's so powerful often is to just say, why are you asking me that question? Because that shifts the whole gaze, doesn't it? And I think
Yep.
that is where we need to be putting the gaze, is on those people, rather than on ourselves.
I'm getting so carried away. I'm forgetting my job here. So one of the things that people are asking in the comments is where can they buy post-colonial banter?
So you can buy it from Verve Poetry Press. So this is the press that have published it, Verve Poetry Press, and it's just online. That's the best place to buy it, personally, because it benefits the author the most. Otherwise, it's just sort of like very down the line. Yeah, so Verve Poetry Press, Post-Colonial Banter. Thank you so much if you do buy a copy. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. And somebody else says your words and delivery are so powerful. Thank you for sharing your experiences. And this person is anonymous, so whoever you are.
Thank you, anonymous. No, thank you for sharing this space. It's really, I think there's something so intimate about these digital performances as well, where it kind of feels like we're all, sharing really intimately.
Your next poem is the next poem you're reading, not necessarily chronologically from the book, but the next one you're reading is British Born and or British Values.
So I think, no, sorry, that was, I'm going to do British Born. I think because we have time, don't we?
We have time, we have time, thankfully.
Maybe I'll just do one and then we can have a bit of a chat, and then I'll end on the final one, if that's okay. So I'll do British Born, which, so to contextualize this, you will have all seen the word British born, and it's that hyphenated term. It's like British hyphen born. And I think it's such an interesting word, because why differentiate between British and British born? And I think what I found in kind of when I was researching around this a while ago was that the term only really comes up. Originally, it was to describe like the generation of migrants who, Commonwealth migrants who were born. So say your parents migrated and then you were born in Britain. So that was sort of a differentiation. But it very quickly became a way to just sort of actually mean that you're constantly never really fully British.
You're just othered. You're always othered. But how do I other you without telling you I'm othering you? So where do you fit? I need to give you a box that you have to fit into.
Exactly. Always. So yeah, it's quite short, this one.
Okay.
Paper says British born. Like that's all it is. Just an accident. They rubbed out British raised, desperately trying to deflect, erasing the context and connection, the fact this society made him, this land, this place, our words, our harm. But he's British born, not British. British, never British. They say the birthplace is somehow random, place his motives in a foreign land. Must be the fact of his grandparents' blood, must be the fact of his skin. What a welcome from the heart of the empire. Raj of the Raj, a massive thumbs up from the hand which sliced us. British born, not British made, foreign goods somewhere deep inside. I am British born, British passport, but neon hijab and signposted skin. Scanner goes off, obviously. A woman feels over me and looks straight through me. Random swabs are made. I am unmade. Passport says British, her eyes say British born only. So yeah, that one's, I feel like it's kind of obvious what that's getting at, but particularly I think because that word is used more and more to talk about, particularly after 7/7, they described the men who were the bombers as British born rather than British. And I think that really did do what I'm trying to say in that poem, where it's like, oh, they did this because of like, you know, some foreign thing that's in them. And that means that we never have to interrogate the context that they live in. And you never have to think, how is Britain culpable and responsible and accountable for the violence that British people perpetrate? And I think we do that constantly.
actually, I want you to continue. I just got carried away there. Yeah, go ahead.
So,
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think another area of my work where I think about this as well is um, I critique a lot the counter-terror apparatus and kind of counter-extremism industry, because all of it is premised on this idea that violence and terrorist violence, which is always differentiated from other kinds of violence, which I think we need to think about, but that kind of violence is seen to be a result of a process of radicalization, and this process of radicalization is seen to really start with somebody being Muslim. Because if you look at all the literature and you look at all the kinds of the things that are written about this, what it really relies on is that something is sparked in somebody, it radicalizes them and makes them violent. But for the thing to be sparked in the first place, they have to be the type of person we have characterized as a society that has that thing in them that gets sparked. And so what I find really, and lots of people have raised this, is it's such a pseudoscientific theory that it doesn't actually recognize that violence, generally when it is perpetrated by anybody, is because of a violent context. So
Yeah,
it's the same with, like the conversation around knife crime and how it's always associated with young Black boys in London. And it's like just something about the way they are means that they're more likely to be violent, rather than saying, what context does somebody live in where they feel the need to carry a knife in the first place? What context does somebody live in where they don't feel safe, where they feel threatened? And I think, when we want to talk about terrorism, what we really need to talk about is, what does it mean to grow up in a country where you are constantly othered, where you're constantly racially profiled, where there's a security and state apparatus which always prioritizes the security of the state rather than the safety of marginalized people, where you're likely to be one of the least educated, least employed groups in the country? And I think if all those contexts were taken into account, we could live in
then we could start working on these challenges in a very similar context. I suppose one other thing you could interrogate in that context of conversation is when the act of terror is committed by the acceptable look. So you have to be white and then you've got a mental health condition, as opposed to you being another race and you are labeled properly as a terrorist. Any comment on that?
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with that. And I think I'm just thinking actually in light of the conversations at the moment that are really exciting around abolition, people talking about the police. Do we need police? Should we have police? Can the police ever be really a force for keeping people safe? And I think in those conversations, what we have to remember is there are different models of justice, and there always have been. And as you've just said, when white people tend to commit the same acts of violence that are described as terrorism in other cases, it's recognized in those cases that this is actually a crisis to do with health, mental health, social upbringing, economic well-being. And suddenly we actually do have a model that understands justice as something much more holistic. And yet when it's a person of color or if it's a Muslim, then it becomes actually, the only way this violence can be explained is because of who they are, what they are, their ideology, a pathology. And so I think in light of these conversations, what we can also take from this is, hey, maybe crime isn't a solid and stable category. Maybe it's actually something that we apply to regulate people. And as Angela Davis says, to not have to deal with social problems, to just disappear people and say, oh, well, they were terrorists anyway. So, that's why they need to be in prison. But rather than saying, what, and that's been obviously happening for Black communities in the US and in the UK for years and decades. And yeah, I think it's a really important moment to actually think if we can, because the other thing, sorry, just add one more thing on that.
Please.
When the government, does anything that is violent, we never call that terrorism, right? And yet Grenfell, a whole building burnt down to the ground, 72 people died, and many more were made homeless, injured, traumatized.
Yeah, and 3 years later.
Right, and it's because the government was more interested in creating aesthetically pleasing housing for rich residents in Kensington rather than the well-being of those people. So is that not violence? Is that not terrorism? Are those people not terrified? Are all the people...
Who's the terrorist in this case? Who is terrorizing?
And the hundreds of thousands of people who live still in houses with that cladding on it, they must be terrified every night going to bed.
Absolutely.
I just think... Yeah, I think thinking about those words, thinking about all of these things should help us move towards a much more critical stance around, well, okay, what does justice actually look like? Because what does justice look like for the people who died in Grenfell? People going to prison is never going to bring those people back. justice actually would look like transforming the conditions that those people had to live in the first place. So yeah, I think that's something for us to think about.
So you are tuned in to Migration Matters Festival. I'm speaking to the poet Suhaiymah, who is just amazing. So her work is around race, tackling issues of race, migration, and religion. And that's why this discussion is quite intense right now. Please stick around and send us some more questions. Suhaiymah, read your next poem for us, please.
Awesome. I think it's probably my last poem. So it's called British Values. I'll just do it without further ado.
Okay.
Young Muslims in Britain often straddle two worlds. They appear to have a foot in each cultural concerns revealed around national identification of Muslims. In review raises alarm over social integration in the UK schools to promote fundamental British values. The face of Britain is changing beyond recognition. I look in the mirror. It's not shattered. I am whole. No one foot in, one foot out. No reason I've got to learn Britishness from the somehow more devout. I'm not uneasy, torn, or straddling. It's not shattered. I am whole. Yet the opposite is somehow all that you'll get told. I mean, I guess because if it wasn't, if we faced up to the glass, you'd be left with the fact that I am inside. I am Britain now. Because Britain is Bismillah. Britain is basmati rice. Britain is box braids and black barbers shops, Bollywood and Bhangra. Britain is Bradford and Barking and Birmingham. Britain is biryani and black beans. Britain is black. Britain is brown. Britain is boys blasting dubstep on the bus to town. Britain is body popping outside the tube. Britain is bricklaying before it was cool. Britain is bilingual. Britain is the burqa. Britain is praying in the changing rooms. Britain has its feet in your sink. Britain is bad at knowing itself, belligerent and boring. Britain has not changed beyond recognition. Recognize it was never one thing. I am the inside you pretend is outside, but we have to stop pretending. Pretending the rolling hills are just romantic, not remnants of injustices swept under a rug. Like the tea didn't come from Asia, like its sugar wasn't grown by slaves, like dry humor isn't a way to just ridicule dissent, and cues don't expose the way we're always told to wait for change rather than making it. And it's funny that over-apologizing is seen as a national trait, because half of history is still waiting. I look in the mirror. It's not shattered. I am whole. There is no brink or turning point. I'm here. Britain is barbaric. Oh, sorry, did you think that was me? Barbaric bystander straddling the boundary, not quite inside. So you could say I'm the things you forgot, like you're modern, so I'm backwards, you're democratic, so you say I'm not. When the truth is, Britain is blood on its hands and back to the wall. Britain is selling weapons to the most repressive regimes in the world. Britain is the bombs the Saudis drop on Yemen. Britain is building surveillance apparatus since 9/11. Britain is believing in human rights whilst removing them all. Britain is Yarl's Wood, Brook House, Colnbrook and Morton Hall. Britain is 1,600 dead in or after police custody since 1990. Britain has no qualms about detaining asylum seekers indefinitely. Britain is suicide attempts, secret courts and secret torture. Britain is stopping you at the border. Britain is seeing it, saying it, sorting it, which means Britain is also deporting it, because what else do you do when you look in the mirror and find sugar and tea had strings attached? The factories on the rolling hills depended on our labor. The bombs destroyed the homes of kids now at the border. Britain is barbaric. Britain is blindly patriotic. Britain is built on false narratives, slices of other people's dishes. Britain is stolen artifacts in museums named after itself. Britain is knife and fork polite, stabbing you at will. Britain is selective. Yours till it's not, in yours till it's not, then blaming you. Britain is borders, Britain is Brexit, Britain is spedding on weddings but not fireproofing homes. Britain is cutting mental health services yet somehow strong and stable. Britain is 50% of young people in custody being from ethnic minority backgrounds, and Britain is blaming them for this statistic rather than asking difficult questions, because Britain is blaming the kids who aren't white. Britain is blaming the immigrants. Britain is blaming the Muslims. Britain is blaming bureaucracy. Britain is not listening. Britain is not that great. Britain is breaking, but breaking everywhere except the place it puts the blame. Because there's only a few things left that are great about Britain. And there, that Britain is Bismillah, basmati and bilingual. Box braids and black barbers shops, Bollywood and Bhangra. Body popping outside the tube, Brick Lane before it was cool. Britain is the burqa. Britain is praying in the changing rooms. Britain has its feet in your sink. Britain is your greatest nightmare, every repercussion you never thought through. Britain is the terror to be counted. Britain is the mind to be got inside. I am the great in Great Britain now, and aren't you terrified? Thank you. Loving the
Oh my God, how do I even come into that? Where do I start? God Almighty. That's just powerful. And the hidden fact that you've just brought out today, it's less commonly talked about, is the detention centers. Women who are detained, the deaths within detention centers. Nobody talks about those deaths. Even now, whilst we're in the heart of campaigning against deaths of people whilst in police custody, we are not talking about that. So thank you
Mm.
very much for doing that with
No, for
your
sure.
work.
I think that's such a important thing as well in this moment because, you know, I don't know if you saw, and I don't know if people who, I'm sure you probably did, but for people who
Mm-hmm.
might not have seen it, with this coronavirus and this pandemic, you know,
Mm-hmm.
in Portugal, they actually, I think it's Portugal, they said everybody who's in immigration detention, let's just release them because that is just going to be a place where it's going to spread like wildfire. And suddenly, then, what you see is that this myth that people have to be in detention centers, immigrants are dangerous, as these asylum seeking people, they might not really be seeking asylum, was just made up because you could have just, when it comes to it, they could just release them like that. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of that and relating it back to some of the stuff you've just read, the conditions that are created in part because of Britain in other countries is what actually causes some of these uh, some of these situations around asylum seeking in this country. So it's that detachment from the reality of what Britain has done elsewhere,
Yeah.
again, that revises history, edits
Mm,
history,
mm,
or erases history, if you will,
no, that's such a
Prime
good point.
Minister.
And actually, just when this pandemic began and the lockdown
Mm-hmm.
started, I was actually on holiday with my grandmother in Pakistan. And what was really interesting is that lockdown there looked very different because you can't just lock down everything because the majority of the population are day wage laborers. So
Mm-hmm.
how you can't, you're gonna, well, the way the prime minister put it was half the population will die of starvation if we lock down, and the other half will die from this virus. So what do you do? And his point was, as you're saying, is what needs to happen is the West needs to abolish the debts that keep our country in debt. And so he made the point that, you know, people aren't in poverty because this is a backwards country, because they're, you know, all of these kind of narratives of racism. Instead, it's because there's literal economic systems of neo-imperialism that
Yep.
mean they can't put resources in the way that we can here in the UK. And I just think, yeah, I'm really glad you raised that because it's,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's such a vital thing that we just get to ignore all the time,
We
is that,
gloss over it. We pretend it doesn't exist. We pretend there's no colonial context. And yes, history is the present as well, because everything that has happened historically in documented history definitely has an impact on 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 migration. And this is why Migration Matters Festival exists. I am going to go into some of the questions because there are quite a few here. So Bandana Data asks, what do you think is the most misinterpreted narrative about Muslim women?
oh wow, okay. I think it's the most misinterpreted. So, hmm, I think I don't think any narratives are misinterpreted, right? I think the problem is that the narratives exist in the first place. And in a way, I almost think that it's the exceptionalizing of Muslim women, the creation of this category Muslim woman, that is in itself the misconception, right? So what, you know, in what other context would you put together, let's say there's a woman who's just very recently fled from any Nigeria. Let's say Nigeria. She's an asylum-seeking woman, and she's a Muslim, and she's in immigration detention. Let's go with that. And then
Yeah.
there's a Somali woman who was a refugee in the 1990s, and she lives in London. And then there's a Pakistani woman who's in her 90s, and she migrated to the UK in the 60s, and she lives in Bradford. And then there's a white woman who grew up in the UK, and she's 16 and she's thinking about converting to Islam. Now, in what way could you ever have a narrative that would encapsulate and could speak about all four of those women and make any sense or have any semblance to grasp that sense? I think the only way that you could is if you were to say, as a Muslim woman, and you were
Yeah.
to talk about theology, and you were to say, as a Muslim woman, I believe X, Y, Z. I believe there's one God. I believe there's a prophet, right? But I think the fact is that when we talk about Muslim women, we're never talking about a group of people who adhere to a certain theology in the public sphere and in kind of public imagination. it's always referring to this lump that are, you know, framed as this this lump of outsiders, unenlightened, you know, patriarchal, all of those things. And so I think really, like, rather than it being an issue of like which narrative is the most you know, problematic one, it's the fact that there is one, right? Because we never say like, oh, you know, white women are so oppressed, and we don't, or kind of, we, I think just to say anything like that. And I think the other thing I would say is just the fact that there are narratives that differentiate oppression, right? So I think what I always find so disingenuous is just this idea that Muslim women experience a specific and exceptional form of patriarchy, right? We live in a society where literally we're talking every day about rape culture. We've got Me Too. We know that we were just talking about, you know, women and asylum seekers who are killed, who are sexually abused. We know if you're a woman in the UK, you know how rife sexism is, whether that's in the workplace, whether it's at school, whether it's in employment. I've just been watching the Jeffrey Epstein documentary, you know, sexual abuse of women that is on a mass scale from the filthy rich of, you know, the elites in our society.
The
So
most
then
powerful people around,
right,
you
so then
know.
why would we exceptionalize and say Muslim women experience something really specific, a really specific form of violence from Muslim men? And I think what you have to remember is when there's a narrative, it's not really important to disprove it. It's more important to ask why it exists. Why do those narratives exist? And they exist for one specific reason: to justify the detention, the detainment, the policing, the surveillance, the accusations that Muslim men, specifically that Muslims more generally in the society face, and to not have to interrogate what it is about British society, about British economics, British politics, British social policies that keep Muslims in positions of kind of like an underclass.
So we're running out of time. I'll ask you a few more questions. So this is from Samaya Wright, who I believe is actually on the board of Migration Matters Festival, if I'm not mistaken. So she said, Salam alaikum. I once had a conversation with another non-Muslim woman who said she likes my hijab, but refused to acknowledge that I had made the choice to wear it. Have you experienced this? And why do you think this is a reaction to us wearing hijab?
Okay, walaikum salam. It's funny, isn't it? Because as much as I have at no point indicated that, you know, this Q&A would even revolve around these questions. Look, it is the one narrative that comes back and back and back. And I mean, obviously you're completely justified to ask that. And I think, yes, of course, I've witnessed that countless times. And it always is in this very patronizing, veiled way of, veiled, to no puns intended, that's kind of like, but you're so intelligent and you're so articulate and you're so eloquent. So why you? Why would you succumb to this violence and this patriarchy? And it's fascinating because what that question, the premise of that question is that this piece of cloth is so powerful and so symbolically significant that it strips me of any agency. So even if you think I'm intelligent, even if you think I'm articulate, blah blah blah, this all just reinforces that I inherently, there is a backwardsness within me that I cannot rid myself of unless I rid myself of this scarf. And yeah, I mean, as I say, it's just rooted in those colonial myths, and those colonial myths had a reason they were there so that there could be domination of society. And Muslim women in particular, remember, you know, women have always been policed in a certain way because women are seen to be either biologically or culturally the reproducers of the culture of a nation, right? So as nations are created, as nationalism kind of takes hold in the 1800s, there was also this focus on women and the representation of women. Now in the UK today, if I say I'm happy being Muslim, I love being Muslim, I'm going to raise my children Muslim, that's threatening. That's threatening because what I'm saying is I'm going to reproduce not only racial others, but cultural others who will have norms, mores, theological beliefs that Britain says it refuses to be able to hold within it. Britain cannot hold within it multitude. And at the end of the day, you know, this whole idea of British values, what it's proved again and again is that Britishness cannot define itself beyond whiteness, because there's this idea that people of color and migrants need to learn British values, and white people, I presume, are just born with them, right? And so
I guess there's the power in disrupting what's considered the norm, the standard. So that kind of excites me. I like to disrupt, and if I'm going to make you feel uncomfortable because of my very existence, then well,
exactly,
let's do that. So Zoya asks, how did you transition from your history degree to poetry? What did the process of developing your art form involve?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would actually say less of a development than, as I said at the introduction, actually, you know, these things for me are all in tandem. So while I was studying history, I began writing and performing poetry at like little open mic nights. And, you know, I think through what it is that through studying history and through studying, let's say, the silences in history and the erasures of history as well, I became politicized. I recognized, oh, you know, why am I not reflected in these books? Why are there only certain narratives about me that are not the narratives I know? And having a creative way to express that was really the only way I could express that, because, you know, you can't within academia make as disruptive claims, especially if you're an undergraduate, right? You don't, like, you're not given any validation. And so it was poetry that you know, I wouldn't necessarily have called it poetry at that time necessarily, you know, it's just writing. But when I discovered exactly,
yeah,
and when I discovered slam poetry and spoken word and you know, what's rooted in sort of like hip hop in the US and these kind of inherently political forms of poetry, I was like, yeah, this is amazing. And so for me, it was quite natural to, you know, as I was studying, I was doing a bit of open mic, I was on the university slam team, and that was all, it was all at the same time. So yeah, it's not really yeah, it wasn't necessarily like a separate decision.
I'll jump into the next question because we're running so late. Thank you for sharing. This is Peter Waldock. He says, thank you for sharing your powerful poems. The issues raised are so important, especially now. But as a white British, in brackets, born man, what should I be doing to help change the rhetoric around race in our country? Ooh, that's loaded.
So yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think that you clearly know there's something you should be doing if you're asking that question, right? And I think really I wouldn't focus on the rhetoric. I would focus on the structures. And I would say you probably have a job. If you don't have a job, you probably have a house. If you don't have a house, you probably have a family. There are things and structures and institutions that you are involved in and invested in. And within those institutions, people won't be using the N word. People won't be sort of explicitly saying really xenophobic things. But what they will be doing is through their decision-making patterns, processes, and behaviors and assumptions, is that they will be disadvantaging people of color at every level. And so I think what you have to do if you are somebody white in this moment is is to really say, in what ways am I invested, consciously or subconsciously, you know, intentionally or non-intentionally, it doesn't matter anymore whether it's intentional or not. In what ways am I invested in upholding a system that makes life almost unlivable for some people and definitely disadvantaging for other people? And so I think a lot of people have been saying, oh, you know, you need to read, you need to learn. I would say the time for learning and reading, you know, it's too late, right? I think it's the time for action. It's the time for acting. And I
do
think
something about it. Do
exactly. And I
something
think
about it.
the word you used earlier was disruption. I think disrupt, because I've just explained to you, we've both just explained how we disrupt constantly in the work we do. And there's so much onus on us to be the disruptors. But how amazing would it be for if I wasn't even in a space and another white person was doing that work of disruption and they were saying at the table, why do we have no black employees in our workplace?
Absolutely. So I'm going to skip Bandana's question because I've asked you one already. So this one is from Rachel Harrison. She says, what poets or novels are you enjoying during lockdown? Also, huge thank you. Totally amazing. Smart, perceptive, cut to the truth.
Yeah. Thank you. That's very kind. Okay, cool question. But to be honest, I've been struggling reading at the moment, if I'm honest. But a couple of things that I've read recently, I'll just say, there's a really good series under Pluto Press, the Outspoken series at the moment, and they're like really radical but accessible kind of takes on different issues. So the one on class is called Split, and I think it's brilliant. And the other one is called Feminism Interrupted by my friend Lola, and it's really good. I think if you kind of call yourself a feminist, and even if you don't, I think it's really important to engage with that text. And I've been reading Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, which I think is really important to read as well.
That's just amazing. Thank you so much, Suhaiymah. Before you go, just to let you know, one of our moderators has put all the sort of links where you can find Suhaiymah and her work. So please, if you want to continue this conversation, interact with her on Twitter. I believe I've just seen that in the chat.
Oh, yeah.
If you see that. And also, again, her book is available from Verve
Press.
Poetry Press.
Colonial Banter.
And it's called Post-Colonial Banter. And the artwork, by the way, the artwork on that book, she did that, by the way. She did that. Yeah. Migration Matters Festival continues tomorrow, and I would like to thank everybody who's participated. Suhaiymah, thank you very much for enriching.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And don't forget, we're currently raising funds in support of two charities that are in Sheffield, South Yorkshire Refugee Law and Justice, and Lesbian Asylum Support Sheffield. And then the proceeds will go into supporting the sustenance of this festival as well as those organizations. So go to migrationmattersfestival.co.uk/donate. And another thank you, Samaya. It's been lovely hosting you tonight. And good night, everybody.
Right, thank you all.
Thank you very much for joining us for this Migration Matters Festival online event. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to make a donation, please visit migrationmattersfestival.co.uk/donate. Your donation will make a difference. Thank you.